Ladies and gentlemen, now the time to introduce our after-dinner talk, if you finished it. Today's speaker is Sir Venki Ramankrishnan, but he is pleased to be called Sir Venki, very easy, because the later part is difficult to pronounce. And Sir Venki is a group leader of the Medical Research Council Laboratory of Molecular Biology in Cambridge and current president of the Royal Society in United Kingdom. He is best known for his work on the structure and function of ribosomes, the large molecules in all cells that read genetic information to make proteins, for which he shared the Nobel Prize for chemistry instead of biology in 2009. His title of today is not known. He didn't tell me. But he will talk about the dark side of science and technology. So, this is very suited because STS, the main topic in light and shadows of STS. So, he will talk about the shadows of science and technology. Please.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here and great honor to be asked to give this talk. I thought I was actually going to be a warm-up act for other people, but I'm afraid you'll have to just do with me. I was walking with David Baltimore this morning, and we were talking about what generation we belong to. And we said if we get to the stage where you need a PSA test, it means you've sort of crossed a threshold if you're male. And I'm afraid if you're asked to give an after-dinner talk, the answer is pretty much the same. And so here I am. So I'm going to talk about the potential and risks of emerging technology, because we all take it for granted that science and technology is an unmitigated good over the long run. It may have some short-term problems that can easily be ironed out. And I just want to, before I forget, I want to thank my co-workers, some of the staff of the Royal Society who've helped me with this. Now, something that people don't realize is that for most of the last 2,000 years, China and Japan were among the richest countries in the world. They had the highest GDP. In fact, they may even have had the highest GDP per capita. But this shows that in the last 300 years, things were rather more dynamic. Things changed. And what you see is a change here, which is the US, and a change here, which is Europe. Okay? And they roughly track each other, but with the US lagging behind Europe. Now, this is, of course, we all know this is the Industrial Revolution, and which happened to start in Britain. And you might ask why the Industrial Revolution started in Britain and very quickly spread throughout Northern Europe. And there are lots of reasons for it. People will argue about it. My favorite explanation is that Northern Europe had the Enlightenment and the Reformation that led to freedom of thought, sort of empiricism, which generated knowledge, and knowledge then generated, triggered the Industrial Revolution. But notice the US, by 1910, had already become the world's single largest economy. And by the sort of 1920s, it had overtaken the combined economic might of Germany, France, and the UK. Now, when you see these things dropping, like China and India, it's not that they're dropping in absolute terms, but they're dropping as a fraction of the world's GDP. And what you see is something remarkable here, which is that around this actually coincides with Deng Xiaoping opening up the Chinese economy. And you can see that there's been a dramatic increase in the economy of China. And this is simply the same graph, but sort of shown differently, just showing what the world's economy is, and the bands show the various countries. And you can see again that China, since Deng Xiaoping, has acquired an increasing fraction of the world's economy. So when you look at what the effects were, if we can think of this as a sort of continuation of that industrial revolution that happened from the mid-1700s on, and if you ask, what was the effect of that industrial revolution? Well, here's a slide. Before 1750, per capita incomes only doubled every 6,000 years. That is to say, they hardly changed at all. In fact, life expectancy didn't change very much for centuries, okay? Now, after 1750, income started doubling every 50 years. And even today, the poorest British citizen is unimaginably rich compared to people 300 years ago in terms of goods, services, in terms of health, etc. So, you know, it shows a dramatic effect of the Industrial Revolution on the quality of people's lives. Now, that revolution is still going on. For example, this is just the last, 20 years or so, and you can see that world poverty is declining, okay? And this just shows you the decrease in the share of the world poverty incidence. And similarly, other things, for example, infant mortality rates, plummeting even in the last 25 years, okay? And this is a continuation of this worldwide phenomenon that started about 300 years ago. Now, it didn't happen accidentally in Britain. I mentioned the Enlightenment and the Reformation and growth of knowledge as a result of that, and then triggering the Industrial Revolution. That's a sort of widespread view. But here's another more concrete reason why it began in Britain rather than somewhere else in Northern Europe. And that is that prior to the Industrial Revolution, if you invented a labor-saving device that would throw lots of people out of work, governments and authorities would actually suppress it. And it was Britain that first, took active steps to protect the spread of machines. So if people try to, for example, the Luddites, there were lots of actually violent struggles against machines. And the government of the time always came down in favor of the spread of technology and the spread of machines. So this could be another possible explanation. Now, obviously, I mentioned the Luddites, and I said that, lots of people were thrown out of work as a result of machines. And the conventional wisdom is that you cause disruptions because of, automation, industry, etc. But these disruptions are quite temporary, and you then get growth of new industries. For example, steel and steam engine give rise to railroads, give rise to lots of other industries and businesses and mining and all sorts of things. And so in the long run, everything sorted itself out, and it was just a temporary blip. Well, fact is, we've forgotten that it wasn't so temporary. When I was a kid, I went to an English school in India, and I was brought up on Charles Dickens. So I know firsthand, I've read Dickens's novels about what the poor were like during the Industrial Revolution. And it turned out it wasn't so short-lived. In fact, millions of people were thrown out of work, and it lasted about 3 generations, okay? So almost 100 years before people were better off, on the whole, in terms of the large numbers of people. This begs the question, in those days, the government could protect the factory owner, protect the machines, and protect the spread of machines. And that's largely because workers were people who didn't own any land and they couldn't vote. Okay? So the question is, would the Industrial Revolution have happened if ordinary workers were also voters at the time? Okay? And it's not at all clear what the result would have been and whether it would have been slower. Now today, we may be at the dawn of a second industrial revolution. Mechanization, of course, has been happening all throughout the first industrial revolution, but it could happen in a much bigger way with the computerization of machines, with machine learning and robotics and so on, and increasingly allowing machines to do jobs that were previously done only by humans. Now, mechanization, we all know, has completely eliminated agricultural work. You only need a tiny agricultural workforce compared to what you needed, say, 150 years ago. But now things are affecting many different areas. And does this have a consequence? Well, one classic graph is what's called the great decoupling between economic growth and median income. If you look from 1980 or so, or even the mid-70s on, this is in the US, median income has hardly grown at all. Even though economic growth has gone up, labor productivity has gone up, GDP per capita has gone up, but that's the mean GDP of the country, but median income has not. And this means that workers are falling behind, that there's greater inequality in society. And so even though economic growth and productivity go up, most, more than half of the people don't share in that. It seems to be a universal phenomenon. The actual numbers are different in the UK, but there's an unmistakable trend in the UK as well, where median income is lagging behind economic growth. Another thing that we can see is that global inequality, even though poverty as measured by various criteria is falling, and infant mortality is falling, etc., inequality is actually grew and has plateaued off at a very high level. It doesn't seem to be increasing anymore worldwide. But I should point out that inequality between countries is also growing as a result of science and technology, and as a result of these new technologies. So the rich countries are even richer, and the poor countries are not catching up nearly as fast. And this sort of inequality is also geographically not uniform. So this shows the female life expectancy at age 65 in the UK, showing different quintiles. And you can see that the distribution is quite non-uniform. So for example, in the north, where manufacturing used to be a big boom, but where there isn't much manufacturing and which is economically depressed, you can also see life expectancy much lower than in the south. And I don't have to tell you about the distribution of votes in the referendum in Britain a year ago. This is a similar figure in the US, and it's astonishing that there's more than 23 years of life expectancy difference between different parts of the US. So red is the lowest life expectancy, and blue is where the highest life expectancy is. It doesn't completely correlate, but it's also, you can see a definite trend if you want to map this onto the results of the latest presidential election in the US. So what's happening is that in addition to the earlier industrial revolution, which produced machines like steam engines and cars and automatic looms and so on, we're now having a second industrial revolution as a result of digitization, of digital technology. We have computerization of machines, we have robotics, we have artificial intelligence, increasingly allowing machines to do jobs previously done by humans. The first impact is on factory work. You need far fewer workers for the same output in a factory that would be constructed today than even, say, 50 years ago. In the future, you may affect completely new areas. For example, driving. Truck driving is a big industry in many industrialized countries. That could become completely automated with the loss of millions of jobs. I believe more than 20 million jobs in just the US alone. I mentioned the mechanization of farming, but this sort of farming is different. This is using artificial intelligence and robotics to do picking of, strawberries and fruits and all those things for which we still need humans today. Now, you could think of this as a working class problem, and it's the middle class that's the politically powerful class historically. But make no mistake, the middle class is also being hollowed out. For example, a lot of work that is now being done by humans as doctors, lawyers, accountants, journalists, even civil servants. There's cases where civil servants are now being briefed by the products of where ministers are being briefed by the products of artificial intelligence. So middle-class jobs are disappearing as well, and this is resulting in a general hollowing out of income, where you have extremes of high income, those people who are very creative and skilled and driving forward the technology, and those who are basically servicing the rich people, and almost sort of a small group of people in the middle who are disappearing. We're also, another area that I'm interested in as a biologist is new genetic technologies. And we're at a threshold there too. For example, we can use synthetic biology and gene editing for all kinds of things. They can be used for agriculture, for medicine, for correcting genetic diseases. But we're at a threshold where we will soon have technical capabilities to edit the germline of humans. And if people say, well, we're going to use this to eliminate really terrible diseases, it would be very hard to make a moral argument against it. But then when they say, well, actually, we don't want to just eliminate diseases. I would like to be taller or fairer or have, stronger or, whatever. And and many of these will be sort of multi-allelic, polyallelic traits. That is, multiple genes are involved. But with the combination of machine learning and the sequencing of thousands or hundreds of thousands of genomes, we don't really know what will happen. And there is a risk then that we will create a two-tier society. We may have a tier of genetically corrected or possibly even genetically enhanced humans, and then we may have the rest of them. And that would be sort of inequality transferred to the sort of biological realm from the economic realm. So what can we do? Well, first of all, we need to understand the problem. We need to understand what are the benefits of these technologies, what are the risks, how do we apply them, how do we regulate them, etc. And I should say, at the Royal Society, and this is not limited to the Royal Society, a number of academies are actively involved in this. We're considering this on a number of fronts. For example, in the case of the future of genetic technologies, we had a trilateral summit with the National Academy of Sciences and the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C. And we're now conducting a series of workshops, and some of them bilateral, and some of them are our own studies to look at these things. The Royal Society also did a trio of related studies. I attended a session on the Internet of Things, and all of these are problems for the Internet of Things. And one of them was on cybersecurity, on machine learning, and on data governance. The digital world is tremendously at risk because of cybersecurity issues, and until we come to grips with that, there are going to be some substantial risks. Machine learning also has tremendous benefits and risks, and there is a problem of data governance. who owns the data? How is it going to be used? And when combined with machine learning, use of data can be very, very powerful, and it can have all sorts of issues like privacy and misuse of data. And so these two have the ability to create disruptions and cause other problems. Now, solutions are harder. It's hard enough to identify the problem, and it's hard enough to then really probe the problem and the issues in detail to really understand the problem. But beyond that, solutions are very difficult. In our recent data governance report, there's a new twist on the Asimov principles of robotics. You know, one of the first law of robotics is you should do no harm, you know, to humans, etc. Well, a more general principle, you know, you could encompass all of Asimov's laws in a simple statement like humans should flourish. Okay, so if humans will flourish as a result of this technology and its implementation, then it's a good thing, and you need to be clear about that. Well, that's a very nice principle, but it's very hard to understand what that means in practical terms. How do you implement such a principle in practical terms? And I suppose there are a number of different facets to this. One is to have proper safeguards on the adoption of new technologies. And this means a careful analysis of the technology, a good regulatory framework, and a good legal framework. And I should say that for many of these things, these sort of regulatory frameworks will almost certainly have to be international, because otherwise it's too easy to evade, you know, legal and regulatory frameworks simply by you know, going to the sort of lowest denominator country, you know, in a race to the bottom, as you might call it. Another way to do it, to check the effects of new technology, is what are called sandboxes, which is you conduct trials which are on a large enough scale so you can see what's happening, but are still restricted from society at large. And so these trials in a limited setting will allow you to see if there are unintended consequences of these technologies. Finally, I mean, all change is going to be disruptive, and that's simply in the nature of new and revolutionary technologies. So we need to be able to prepare populations for disruptive change. It's not going to be the case anymore that you take a job when you're 18 years old and then you retire at 65 with a gold watch from the same factory where you started. And this then requires that you start off with a broad and flexible education that allows you to be retrained later on. And life may be a process of continued education as you go through life and technologies change and you have to adapt. And finally, we need to think about how we deal with it as societies, as you know, in the face of these disruptions. For example, we need to have proper financial safety nets. This means taxation and redistribution. We need to have retraining. Another idea that has been touted is a basic minimum income, which I'm in favor of, but of course, you know, many conservatives might not be. But these are all things that we need to discuss in an open and transparent way, because otherwise we're going to be sleepwalking into an era where we have huge social rifts, and you can already see the consequences of these rifts. It's not just Britain, but you can see elections throughout Europe, in France, and in the recent election in Germany. You can see the rise of discontent, and Eastern Europe is another case in point. So you can see that there are going to be massive social upheavals and discontent unless we actually start recognizing the problem and dealing with it. So I realize it's not been a very light and humorous after-dinner speech, but I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sir Benki. He showed the shadows, and we need big challenges. But of course we know challenge means also opportunities. And so now we wish to welcome a few questions because we have about 5 minutes. Okay, please.
I'm Sergio Gariba from Italy. I liked very much your speech. You are referring to the developed countries, however. I mean, the countries are different through the world. And, I mean, let's assume there is, say, a country which is going to develop. Then the new technology will have a completely different impact. And I think we have to consider the differences. Thank you.
Yes, that's a very important problem where if you have a country that is not industrialized and you have adopt new technologies which don't employ very many people, then it's not going to have the same benefits. You're quite right. And that's why I said this trend is not only increasing inequality within developed countries, but is exaggerating the inequalities between developed countries and poor countries. So it's a serious problem.
Thank you. Have other questions or comments? Okay. Okay, please.
Thank you very much for that perspective. I was really struck by your comparison to the Luddites. And as I look at this with globalization, there's going to be a tremendous amount of pressure from the private sector to take on many of these innovations that you've identified as really creating a divide. And what's your perspective about how science and technology, which are driving these developments, work with the private sector to ensure that we don't have this divide?
Yeah, it's a hard problem. On the one hand, you know, the free market economy has really contributed to the growth of nations and the growth of wealth, generation of wealth. And so the question is, how do you combine the good things about a free market economy with the problems created by new technologies and disruption? And I think the real answer is that countries have to, first of all, understand that you can't ever have a completely unrestrained free market economy. That is not going to be the answer, the optimal solution, even in the long run. And what we will need is a combination of regulation and laws, but also international regulation and agreement, so that as new technologies emerge, then we have appropriate safeguards and laws in place. Now, within countries, I think there's no alternative to making sure that there are good, strong social safety nets for these kinds of disruption. There's a strong educational system, and that allows populations to sort of ride out these ups and downs created by the growth of technologies. But I think left to themselves, I don't think companies would have the incentive to do what's best for society. There's a built-in conflict of interest. Companies are incentivized to provide the maximum benefit to their shareholders, but their shareholders are not society. And so we need to somehow bridge those two without destroying the good things about a market-based economy.
Thank you. Maybe, sorry, but I think the final question, no, not you, but he was the first. No, he's okay. Yeah.
I'm okay. Thank you very much. Cheers. Arigatou gozaimasu. I really agree with the central philosophical and strategic thrust of your input. The only thing that I have a quibble with is the inversion or the generalization of Isaac Asimov's law, where you say humans must flourish. That for me seems to be an anthropocentric view of the universe, where humans are privileged. But we have all other species that have taken billions of years to evolve on our planet. Why should humans have the a priori right to flourish and not the natural biodiversity of other species?
Yeah.
So maybe I would advise a slight revision of that with your permission. Thank you.
Sir Venki, if you answer quickly,
Yes.
I can welcome another question.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, it depends on what you mean by flourish. I would not call a devastated environment where there's lots of species loss as flourishing, okay? So if I say humans are flourishing, it means that the rest of the world is pleasant for us to live in and is a nice sort of world to live in. So I think, we could generalize that.
Thank you. Yeah, you are the final
Thank you very much for last chance. Well, in your slide, you said that if the voters, all the labor workers has a vote, then the British Industrial Revolution could be accomplished. That was very impressive to me. But these days, all the workers, they all have the vote. So in this case, to make a kind of revolution, what do you think is a new solution?
A new solution to what? Sorry, could you repeat
for the
that?
revolution of the new industrial revolution.
I see. Well, democratic countries are facing a significant problem. As you know from recent elections, there is a huge discontent. And you may, in the 1930s, there was a similar discontent because of the depression and economic inequalities. So I think, again, if you have a society which allows those people who are at a disadvantage to recover, to give them dignity, to give some basic maintenance and income, and allows them to retrain, then I think you won't have, people will be okay with new technologies because they'll see that there's opportunities for them. It's when they feel thrown out of work with no opportunities. I think that's the real problem.
Thank you very much. I wish I had more time, but this is a very nice topic. Thank you very much.